Hi, folks, and welcome to Week 9's mini lectures. We're more than halfway through the class, so congratulations. This week, we're going to discuss what is often referred to as the Progressive Era. Over the first half of this course, we witnessed the horror show of the Gilded Age, redemption and white supremacist terrorism perpetuating violence in the South as a means of controlling and disenfranchising freed blacks. On the Upper Plains, we saw military campaigns against Native Americans, including massacres, and also the ecocide of the bison. Industrialization and capital accumulation furthered wealth inequality and contributed to the desperation of industrial workers, leading them to strike and unionize. Industry resisted this organization with violence, whether hired thugs or private detectives or the state militia. They all attacked the striking unionists. In the factories, mines, and other workscapes, men, women, and children toiled in dark, unsafe environments. Impoverished immigrants crowded into the filthy cities, and the expansion of the American Empire into the Philippines brought serious questions about what the United States meant and who could be a citizen. We look back on these issues with a bit of shock. A legacy of historical amnesia plagues our understanding of the era. The narratives of industrialization are swept under the rug of robber barons through caricature. Men with monocles chomping on cigars, or justified as necessary for the expansion of American industry. The narrative of Reconstruction as failure whitewashes the causes of the Civil War into a disagreement over states' rights instead of over the system of racialized slavery. However, in the era, many people looked on these same issues with a similar horror that we feel. And they saw an impetus to action and a call to change. They witnessed the power of industrialization to reshape social, political, environmental, and economic relations, and wanted to address the disparities of the era. I'm not going to go into every detail of the progressive movements of the era. That would take an entire course. If you want more, there's a book by Michael McGarr called A Fierce Discontent, which gives a good history of the era. Instead, I'm going to give a highlights reel of the rise of muckraking journalism, women's suffrage, temperance, and the disparities between economic and social progressivism in the era. In order to fight an interlocked set of structural problems threatening the health of the body politic, those structural problems need to be first exposed. The progressive movement was largely a middle-class phenomenon, and many activists and supporters found their awakening and motivation by reading investigative journalism. Its detractors, or targets, called the investigative journalism of the day muckraking journalism, a polite euphemism for shoveling shit. They felt that the role of the press was not to expose the inner workings of industry or government corruption, and instead just report the facts, the truth. However, and in my mind, thankfully, a free press is an essential institution, and the investigative journalists of the era took these criticisms as challenge. The most famous set of muckraking journalists came together at McClure's Magazine out of New York City. In one issue in 1903, McClure's dropped 4 of the foundational stories of muckraking journalism, examining Standard Oil's ruthless business practices, government corruption in several cities, and several other major issues. It dropped like a bomb. McClure's circulation went through the roof for years. Whether it was Upton Sinclair's fictionalized accounts of Chicago's meatpacking industry in the jungle, Joseph Reese's photojournalism to document the conditions faced by the urban working poor in its slums and tenements, or Ida Tarbell's examination of Standard Oil, investigative journalism reflected one of the major middle-class institutional challenges to the industrial order. Striking workers could be written off as socialists, radicals, and immigrants deluded by corrupt union bosses. But the same could not be said of well-known middle-class journalists and activists. And this journalism spurred government action and got real reforms through. Do you enjoy the fact that there isn't formaldehyde in your milk? The Food and Drug Administration came out of public pressure spurred by muckraking journalism. Are you a fan of not having a single monopoly control an entire industry? Ida Tarbell's muckraking and activism pushed Roosevelt to target Standard Oil as an unfair monopoly. Do you think that the government should answer to its constituents instead of outside money? Thank the muckrakers. Do you think politicians should be accountable to the public? Thank an investigative journalist. As president, Theodore Roosevelt worked closely with the investigative journalists of the day. In a speech, he said, quote, "There are, in the body politic, economic and social, many and grave evils, and there is urgent necessity for the sternest war upon them. There should be relentless exposure of, and attack upon, every evil man, whether politician or businessman, every evil practice, whether in politics, in business, or in social life. I hail as a benefactor every writer or speaker, every man who, on the platform, or in book, or magazine, or newspaper, with merciless severity makes such an attack, provided that he, in his turn, remembers that the attack is only of use if it is absolutely truthful." Approximately half of the population are women. Until the passage and ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, women in the United States could not vote, and therefore could not participate in the federal political process. It was effectively gendered disenfranchisement. Exclusion from the political process bred a righteous discontent among women. Restricting political participation to men was part and parcel of ensuring women's subordination in these social, economic, and political realms. In response, women agitated and organized for equal rights, at least when it came to white women's voting rights. We now refer to this era of activism as first wave feminism. Suffragists protested and petitioned for the right to have a voice. And they're suffragists, not suffragettes. Suffragettes was a slur against them. Beginning with the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, women such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony pushed for voting rights for women. When the 15th Amendment was ratified, these early feminists wondered why uneducated black men received the franchise when educated white women still did not. Suffragists pushed hard for voting rights, petitioning, protesting, and agitating for their right to vote a voice in the political process. And it was a transatlantic phenomenon, with suffragists from England, Europe, Canada, and the US communicating and collaborating. As with much of what we've seen in this course, impetus for change came from the American West. Wyoming was the first state to grant women suffrage, partially as a means of statehood, but also as a recognition of a woman's role and works in settling the state. The Mormons in Utah supported women's suffrage as well, and women increasingly gained state voting rights across the West. Montana sent the first woman to Congress with Jeannette Rankin, who was seated as Montana's representative before women won the right to vote nationwide. Women fought for the right to vote. They were arrested, beaten, imprisoned, mocked, and otherwise maligned. When they started fighting, they had no reason to think they'd ever get voting rights, but they organized and fought anyway, and won the right to participation in the political process. Intertwined with women's concerns about gaining a political voice were their concerns about their households and health. Codified in the American legal tradition were laws about what women could own and control, whether it was property ownership or money. Women overwhelmingly worked in the domestic and reproductive spheres, but they acted as economic actors. Generally, men earned the wage and most of the cash or monetary income of the house, which gave husbands a lot of control over the finances of the household and limited the powers of women. We saw in Killing for Coal the pay schedule and scale of miners. They would receive pay for their labor either bi-weekly or monthly, often a fat stack of cash in an envelope. That money had to last until the next pay envelope, and if it were in scrip, the company store certainly took their cut. However, many industrial jobs were what can be called homosocial, a gendered social activity or sphere. In the late 19th and early 20th century, drinking was also a homosocial activity. I'm certainly not suggesting that women did not drink, but they did not drink in a social setting as that of men. Male industrial workers would often cut the dust and grime out of their mouths at the end of a long shift with hard liquor. On a payday weekend, they might blow through a good portion of their pay envelope, and then their family would be left to make do for the rest of the month on what remained after alcohol took its share. Alcohol also contributes to domestic abuse, even if it wasn't defined as abuse in the era. In agitating for temperance, women were attempting to control the affairs of their household. If you reduce liquor consumption, then there is more money in the household for annoying things such as food, education, and clothing, but also lower rates of domestic abuse and marital rape. Some women turned their activism into direct action. Among my favorites is Carrie Nation, who was notorious for attacking bars and saloons with a hatchet. She would invade the establishment, decry the evils of drink, and then break open the liquor casks and bottles with her weapon of choice. And she was often accompanied by a choir of other women's temperance activists who would sing hymns as Carrie Nation swung her hatchet. The threat of arrest never deterred her. She had over 30 arrests on her record and spent several stints in jail. I don't think I would have wanted to cross Ms. Nation. Granted, many temperance activists, including the hatchet-wielding Nation, argued for the immorality of alcohol, but many of their current concerns intersected with domestic concerns over finances and physical abuse. Temperance and suffrage, therefore, represent intertwined strands of women's activism in the Progressive era. Alright, I'm going to close out this mini lecture by talking about two different ideas of progress during the Progressive era: social and economic progress. Social progress involves the ideas that society can be improved, that it can progress through reform toward better conditions in its cities and towns, and that uplifting the people means a stronger society overall. Social reformers, such as Jane Addams, ran welfare organizations dedicated to educating new immigrants and building social structures for them to help them integrate in American society. Temperance advocates tried to get folks to drink less so that their family life could be more. And muckraking journalists tried to expose poor working conditions and the nefarious business practices that kept industrial wages down. The other side of progressivism was a belief in economic growth as a driver of progress. The more industry, the more jobs, the stronger the economy, the higher consumer demand, the better the wages. Industrial expansion, heralded by coal smoke, meant progress to economic progressives. Rather than necessarily devoting time and resources to reform efforts, economic progressivism saw potential in a well-organized industrial system. Its heroes were the engineer and the inventor, striving towards new technologies in the name of efficiency, to communicate faster and smarter, to reduce cost, and to make industry better and more productive and ensure its expansion. Perhaps the best example of economic progressivism is in the construction of the Panama Canal. It was a tremendous feat of social and civil engineering that involved all of the messiness of race and empire and transformed the world to favor American commercial expansion. After a French company failed to build a canal across the Isthmus of Panama, the U.S. engaged in a brief act of regional destabilization and funded a separatist movement, which tossed a happy little revolution and declared the Panama Isthmus a separate nation-state from Colombia. The new U.S. then negotiated with its new friend, the government of Panama, and secured the rights to build the Panama Canal. It became an experiment in social engineering, as workers were employed and paid according to race. White workers received pay in gold or U.S. dollars, where non-white workers received far less money on the silver scale. Housing was also according to race, as was healthcare. Yellow fever is a major mosquito-borne illness, and the Panama Canal became a site of sanitation experiments after a yellow fever outbreak. And the Panama Canal was constructed at a huge human cost. 5,609 workers died in the construction of the canal, but of the dead, only 350 were white Americans. The image on the right of this slide, over here, is Teddy Roosevelt, sitting at the controls of a Bucyrus shovel in the Panama Canal. It's a pretty famous image, projecting ideas of whiteness, civilization, and control. The juxtaposition is rather stunning. A prominent white man controls a massive, hulking piece of dark machinery, literally moving the earth and oceans in the name of American commerce. Progress came through huge machines, technocratic management, engineering, and strict social rules. Alright, I think that's it for this mini lecture. We'll pick up on conservation in the next lecture.